Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Kids Talk Church History. Kids Talk Church History is a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer on Kids Talk Church History, a podcast in partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals.
Now I saw in my dream that the highway up which Christian was to go was fenced on either side with a wall, and that wall was called salvation. Up this way, therefore, did burdened Christian run, but not without great difficulty, because of the load on his back. He ran thus till he came at a place somewhat ascending, and upon that place stood a cross, and a little below, in the bottom, a sepulchre. So I saw in my dream that just as Christian came up with the cross, his burden loosed from off his shoulders and fell off his back and began to tumble, and so continued to do so till it came to the mouth of the sepulchre wherein it fell, and I saw it no more. Then was Christian glad and lightsome, and said with a merry heart, "He hath given me rest by his sorrow, and life by his death." Some of you might have recognized this passage. It's from the book The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, a book that has been translated into more than 200 languages, set to music, and made into movies. What's best, it's a book that inspired many Christians for centuries. Stay tuned for this episode of Kids Talk Church History to find out more about this book and its author. I'm Trinity. I'm 16. I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
And I'm Christian. And I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
I'm Sean, and I live in Augusta, Kansas.
So I read this book. I read Pilgrim's Progress probably about 6 months ago, and I really liked how it kind of showed all the troubles and the things that Christians would face. And I can easily see why it's such a popular book. It's very engaging, and it's a good description of the Christian life, like I was saying.
We've actually done a mini poll to see what other kids thought of it as well. Besides the main character, Christian, some favorite characters were Faithful, Valiant for Truth, and Greatheart. The girls like Christiana and Mercy.
Who are Christiana and Mercy?
Christiana was Christian's wife, and Mercy was her friend. At first, Christiana didn't want to follow Christian in his pilgrimage, but then she changed her mind and left on the same path with her 4 kids and her friend Mercy. This was in a second book Bunyan wrote called Pilgrim's Progress Part 2.
They sounded pretty brave.
Yes, although at one point they realized that they had greatly underestimated the dangers. Thankfully, they had some helpers along the way, especially Greatheart, who escorted them and saved them from a lion. And I'm glad John Bunyan decided to write a sequel and include Christiana and Mercy, otherwise it would sound as if only men could go to heaven.
The second book isn't as famous as the first one, though.
Yeah, it's not really as famous. Also, Bunyan wrote other books that didn't come as famous as well, including a book of poetry. I read a poem that's a conversation between a man and a spider. The man despises the spider for being ugly, weak, and poisonous, but the spider replies that at least he's the way God made him and is still doing what God intended him to do, while man disobeyed God and lost much of the glory and beauty he had originally.
Good answer.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive that Bunyan wrote so much, especially the book that is considered a masterpiece when he didn't have much formal education.
Yeah, before becoming a pastor, Bunyan was a tinker, someone who repaired pots. He followed his father's profession, but he loved to read, and I think he eventually read a lot when he had a better education.
Yeah, I read that pretty early on. He was a pretty naughty kid.
Yeah, he liked to hang out around bad company and didn't really care about God. He thought that obeying God was like being in a prison. He had some close calls with death that made him think for a while, but then he went back to his bad habits. He went to church because back then it was mandatory, but it didn't have much of effect on him.
Maybe he didn't really preach the gospel. I remember as a kid, I went to a lot of churches that had prosperity preachers. It's very famous kind of preaching back in Florida.
It was actually a group of women who led him to the gospel. He heard them talking about God and didn't really understand what they were saying because they were talking about a new spiritual birth and the working of God's Spirit in people's lives. He had never heard of that in the church.
It must not have been a good church.
Yeah, There were problems in the Church of England at that time. Many pastors were not prepared to preach the gospel, and that's why the Puritans tried to change things. There's actually a lot more we can say about Bunyan, but we'd better let our guest, Dr. Shannon Murray, tell us more about him. Dr. Murray is professor of early modern and children's literature at the University of Prince Edward Island on the east coast of Canada, and is the president of the executive committee of the International John Bunyan Society. Dr. Murray, thank you so much for agreeing to join us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about.
Great. And we mentioned that Bunyan, as a young man, hung around with some bad company and actually became the ringleader of it. His language was so foul that even a woman who didn't have a good reputation for clean language told him to stop or he would infect the whole town. How did he go from that to being a pastor?
Well, slowly, I think, is the answer. He tells the story in his autobiography, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, which is a wonderful little book to read. And he chooses some of the episodes and experiences that he says brought him to that, from being a really bad kid to being a very godly man and pastor. And one of those is one that you mentioned, actually being so foul-mouthed that a woman of a bad reputation thought that he was cursing too much even for her. But he talks about other things too. He talks, for example, about having his life saved in extraordinary ways, at least 3 times, twice when he was saved from drowning, and once when he was in the New Model Army during the Civil War, and some other soldier took his place, and that soldier was shot and killed. So he saw all of those as ways in which perhaps God was saving him for something else. And eventually, even when he was supposed to have been a good man, at least outwardly he looked like he was being godly, he knew that he wasn't. And he saw in a doorway 3 women sitting in the sunlight and talking about the things of God. And heard a kind of language that he didn't fully understand. And that was one of those extraordinary experiences that brought him to first back to the church in Bedford, and then to preaching himself. But I always find it kind of encouraging that it wasn't just one thing. It was really slow, and it took him a long time to get to that point.
Yeah, those are wonderful experiences. Bunyan was in prison for preaching without a license. Could he have gotten a license, perhaps?
No, it's a great question. Not at the time he was first imprisoned. And this is a time of such upheaval, political and religious. And in 1660, the monarchy is restored, and there are all kinds of changes. He's imprisoned in 1660 because there are 2 things that he was supposed to be doing. One is that he was supposed to be going to church in the Church of England, and he didn't show up. And the second was that he was preaching to small groups. So it was against what was called the Conventicle Act. So both of those landed him in jail. At this point, no, there was no way for him to get a license to preach as a Baptist preacher. He would have to have gone to be a priest in the Church of England. And that was the case for most of his 12 years of imprisonment, if you can believe that. That's an incredibly long say, until what's called the Act of Indulgence. And that's eventually what allowed him to get out. That's the point at which there were temporary licenses that were offered to some nonconformist preachers. They were eventually revoked, and he went back to prison for a short time again. So again, you see this upheaval happening. But no, he could not, in good conscience, have got a license to preach in those early days. And because he refused to say he wouldn't preach, that they just wouldn't let him out of jail.
I see. And I've read that while he was in prison for 12 years, he felt terrible about leaving his family behind. He was especially concerned about his blind daughter, Mary, because life back then was even harder for people with a disability. But I think his wife, Elizabeth, and even Mary were an encouragement to him. Can you tell us more about them?
Yeah, and this is a time when the families could visit easily, and they were actually required in some cases to provide the necessities of life, including food. And Mary, for example, is supposed to have brought him soup every day that he was in prison. Elizabeth, I think, is quite extraordinary. They married when Elizabeth was just 18. And Bunyan himself already had 4 small children. It was soon after that that he went to prison. She was left on her own, and she not only helped him with visits and support while he was in prison, but she went to London to try to speak in front of magistrates to get him released. I mean, she was quite an extraordinary woman. I kind of wish we had more of her story. But both of them were quite extraordinary supports for Bunyan in that time. And you're right. He said he worried that in doing what followed his conscience, it was as if he were pulling the house down around his wife and children.
Yeah, so you were kind of talking about prison and other things like that where he was. So I kind of heard, I forgot where, but I heard that he was not in a terrible prison and he was maybe able to visit his family and go to church sometimes. Was that true, or maybe something else?
Yeah, it was true certainly at the beginning. So for the first little while that he was in prison, he had lots of visitors, and he was in fact let out. So he could go, he apparently went to London at one point, he preached. But then there were complaints about this, and so he was put a little bit more under lock and key than he had been before. No prison is really good, but I think if we're thinking of the Bastille or those big prisons in London at the time, the prison in Bedford that he was in for those 12 years certainly wasn't as dire as that, but there were examples of overcrowding. And if illness came through, it went through everyone. There was plague that ran through the prison at one point. So certainly not a great place to be. But two of the things that were wonderful for Bunyan was that, first of all, he was allowed to talk to a lot of other people who've been locked up for the same reasons, right? So lots of other nonconformist Christians who are in prison, and they're chatting and they're figuring out what they're going to do when they get out. The second thing is that he was allowed at least 2 books, the Bible and Fox's Book of Martyrs, and he was allowed to write. And so not to suggest that prison's a great thing because he got a lot of leisure time, but he was able to do that kind of writing that spread his thinking and his stories and his ideas much further than it would have been possible if he hadn't been in prison. So just the fact that they allowed him that space to write was an extraordinary thing.
How long was he in prison, and how did he get out?
12 years altogether. There were times that he was let out and then came back in again. So it wasn't 12 years straight. But he was let out in 1672 because of the Declaration of Indulgence. And this was Charles II who determined that it was possible to license preachers who were not simply the priests from the Church of England. So he did get a license at that point, and he was allowed out at that point to continue his preaching for a short time. That act was repealed again, and so he was in prison for a short time after that. But that's basically how he was let out. I mean, he was in for 6 months first. He was threatened with banishment. If he returned, it was going to be execution. So imagine just all the upheaval in that time. And even after he was let out in 1672, he was still always under the threat that a law could change and he could be back in again.
What did he do when he got out?
Well, as you can imagine, his poor family for all that time, he was pretty destitute. He had been a tinker, as I think Trinity mentioned before. He looked after pots and pans, fixed pots and pans for a living, but it doesn't seem as if he returned to that work. He was already famous as a preacher before he went in, and so he continued to preach when he got out and was apparently quite a sought after preacher and speaker. So and writing, of course. So those seem to have been his occupations when he left the prison.
Do you think he expected his Pilgrim's Progress to become so popular?
Oh, I love that question. And my answer is sort of a yes and no. My guess is that he wouldn't be surprised that it would catch on for the people he had intended in his little circle, right? So for other nonconformists in England at that time. I think what would have really shocked him is that it would become one of the greatest influences on children's literature for the next 200 years, that it would be one of the most commonly read books in English, along with the Bible, and most often printed and translated in the world, that it would end up in a variety of different versions in not only in children's literature, but in Africa, and would have an influence on the early history of North America and the US in particular. So I think that really would have surprised him.
Yeah, and I think this is just a side question that I thought of.
Yeah.
Where did he write his Pilgrim's Progress? Was that in prison, or maybe he thought of it in prison and then wrote it while he got out of prison, or where was that?
Yeah, he wrote it when he was in prison, and that first part was written all in prison. And there's a moment, if you read the book, where he says that the speaker gets out of the den and then he's back in the den again. That's the time that he gets out of prison, and then he's put back in prison again. So he actually marks when he's in jail. The narrator does when in Pilgrim's Progress itself. So some of the other writing happened afterwards, but yeah, that first part of Pilgrim's Progress that's so famous is in prison. Amazing example of prison literature.
So, do you have a favorite character or favorite episode from the Pilgrim's Progress?
Yeah, so many. I love hope as a virtue anyway, so Hopeful is my favorite character. And my favorite episode is the Doubting Castle episode, the Giant Despair. Even if I don't have time to teach my students the whole of Pilgrim's Progress, I give them that little excerpt because it's so much like a folk and fairy tale. And at the same time, it seems so realistic about how despair and doubt feel, right? It feels like you're locked in a prison. And I think it's also kind of maybe accidentally, maybe purposefully funny when Christian is locked in this terrible dungeon and Hopeful's there with him. And he says, "Oh, look, I had the key in my bosom the whole time." Like he actually has the key on him that allows him to escape. And Hopeful says, "That's good news," which I think is one of the greatest puns, right? Because you know what good news, the other way of thinking of good news is. And then off they go. And as the giant's chasing them, he just has an epileptic fit and falls down. So I think that's just a brilliant, brilliant episode. And Hopeful is always such a sweet, younger, supportive character on that road.
Now, we just have 2 questions we ask all our guests.
Yeah.
First, how did you become interested in church history? And in your case, how did you become interested in John Bunyan in particular?
Well, my interest in church history really came through reading literature. I went to university to study John Milton, who is a contemporary of Bunyan's. And one of my teachers said, "Well, if you really want to know Milton, you should start with Bunyan." And I kind of got sidetracked. So I actually wrote my thesis on Bunyan instead of on Milton because I got so fascinated by how he described his life story in Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. So I'm literature first, but the church history was interesting to me because it's the sort of cauldron in which this amazing literature comes. And that's where I got interested in Bunyan, and then started to teach children's literature and to teach Pilgrim's Progress as one of the early examples of children's lit.
Second question, this is probably pretty obvious, but if you could meet anyone from church history, who would it be?
Yeah, well, I would love to meet John Bunyan. I'd especially love to have John Bunyan and John Milton in a room together. Very different sorts of characters, both nonconformists, an independent Christian and a Baptist, both dealing with blindness, but Milton himself and Bunyan and his family. But one extraordinarily educated and one barely educated. I think they'd be fascinating to listen to. So it would definitely be those two in the room if I could.
Dr. Murray, we're so thankful that you decided to spend time with us. We appreciate all your answers. And listeners, you can keep telling us what you think of these episodes and keep asking amazing questions. We'll pass them on to our guest experts as soon as possible. And we're planning a big giveaway for Christmas with a bunch of books from Simonetta Carr, courtesy of Reformation Heritage Books. So be sure to enter on our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org. in partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts, Christian and Sean. I am Trinity. Thank you so much for listening to Kids Talk Church History.